The first time I noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Lenora was during one of those quiet afternoons in early fall. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, and I was sitting on my porch, lost in my own thoughts. Lenora, my 60-year-old neighbor, had lived next door for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of woman everyone noticed, but not in the way you'd expect. There was a quiet elegance about her, a certain grace in the way she moved, as if the years had only polished her. That day, I watched her as she watered the flowers in her garden. She didn't see me at first, too engrossed in her task, her hands moving gently over the delicate petals. It was a peaceful scene, one that I had witnessed countless times before, but for some reason this time, it felt different. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way the soft evening light caught in her silver-streaked hair, that made me stop and really look at her for the first time. When she finally glanced up, her eyes met mine, and she smiled, a warm, knowing smile that sent a strange flutter through my chest. I smiled back, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had settled over me, but it lingered, even as she turned back to her flowers. There was something about her, something I hadn't noticed before, and for the rest of the evening, I couldn't quite get her out of my mind. A few days later, we ran into each other again. I was outside, struggling to fix a broken fence panel, when Lenora appeared at the edge of her yard, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. "Need some help with that?" she called, her voice smooth and calm, with a hint of amusement. I looked up, wiping the sweat from my brow. "I think I'm a bit in over my head here," I admitted with a chuckle. She smiled and walked over, her steps slow and deliberate. "Well, lucky for you, I'm pretty handy with a hammer." She kneeled down beside me, her presence immediately making the moment feel lighter, easier. As we worked side by side, I couldn't help but steal glances at her. Up close, she was even more striking. The fine lines around her eyes only seemed to add to her beauty, and there was a confidence in the way she moved, as if she was perfectly at ease with herself, with the world. "You don't see many people fixing things themselves anymore," she said after a while, her tone casual. "Everyone's too busy these days. Too impatient." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm in her presence. "I guess I like to keep my hands busy," I replied. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I felt something shift between us. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A quiet, unspoken connection. "I know what you mean," she said softly, her gaze lingering on me just a second too long before she turned back to the fence. That brief moment left me with an unsettling feeling, something I couldn't quite place. As we finished the repair, Lenora stood up, dusting off her hands. "Well, I think that should hold for now," she said with a satisfied smile. "Thanks for your help," I replied, my voice sounding strangely distant in my own ears. "I owe you one." She smiled again, a soft, mysterious smile that seemed to hint at something more. "I'm sure you'll find a way to repay me," she said lightly, before turning and walking back to her garden. I watched her go, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. Something had changed between us in those brief moments, something I didn't fully understand, but I knew I wouldn't be able to forget it. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Lenora more often than I cared to admit. Every time I saw her, whether she was out in her garden or simply passing by, there was a strange tension that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, like a quiet hum in the background, but it was impossible to ignore. I'd catch her glancing at me from across the street, her eyes lingering just a moment longer than they should, and each time, I'd feel that same flutter of something deep in my chest. It didn't make sense. She was my neighbor, a woman I'd known for years, someone I'd always respected but never thought of in that way. And yet, now, there was something undeniably magnetic about her. It wasn't just her looks, though she was still a beautiful woman, even at 60. It was something deeper, something about the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence she exuded. She was a woman who knew who she was, who had lived through enough to be comfortable in her own skin, and that was something I found myself drawn to more and more. One afternoon, I was sitting in my living room, flipping aimlessly through a book, when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, But when I opened it, there she was, Lenora, standing on my porch with a small basket in her hands. "Hi," she said with that warm smile that always seemed to catch me off guard. "I baked too many cookies, and I thought you might like some." I smiled back, though my heart had already started to race. "Thanks. Come in." She stepped inside, her presence immediately filling the small space. I led her to the kitchen, where she set the basket down on the counter. There was an easy familiarity in the way she moved, like she had been in my home 100 times before. We chatted for a bit, small talk about the neighborhood, the weather, the usual. But even as we spoke, there was an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken but undeniable. After a while, she glanced at me, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You seem a little distracted," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of concern. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. The truth was I was distracted, but I didn't know how to explain why. Not without crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied, trying to brush it off, but the words felt hollow. Lenora stepped closer, her eyes still fixed on mine. "Anything you want to talk about?" she asked, her tone gentle, almost soothing. I swallowed hard, feeling the tension between us grow thicker with every passing second. There was something in her gaze, something that told me she understood more than I was letting on. And suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to tell her everything, to admit the confusing thoughts and feelings that had been swirling in my mind since that day in the garden. But instead, I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, I'm fine." Just a lot of little things piling up. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she reached out, placing a hand on my arm in a gesture that was meant to be comforting. But the moment her skin touched mine, it felt like a spark ignited between us. My breath hitched, and I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something that mirrored the same confusion and desire I had been trying so hard to push away. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there, her hand still on my arm, the silence between us charged with a tension that neither of us could deny. And then, slowly, she withdrew her hand, but the air between us still crackled with the unspoken. "I should probably go," she said softly, her voice suddenly quieter, as if she too had felt the shift in the air. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah. Thanks again for the cookies." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something else there now, something I couldn't quite name, but I knew she felt it too. She left without another word, and as the door clicked shut behind her, I stood there, my heart pounding, wondering what exactly had just happened. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the moment in the kitchen. The way her touch had lingered, the look in her eyes, the way the air had seemed to thicken between us. It wasn't just my imagination. There had been something there. Something real. But what did it mean? And what was I supposed to do about it? For days, I tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts of Lenora to the back of my mind. But it was impossible. Every time I saw her, that same tension returned, and I found myself watching her more closely, wondering if she was thinking the same things I was. The way she moved, the way she smiled, even the way she looked at me. Everything seemed to carry a deeper meaning now. Then one evening it happened. It was late, and I was sitting on my porch, the night air cool against my skin, when I saw her. Lenora was standing in her front yard, her arms folded across her chest, looking up at the sky. She didn't see me at first, but I watched her for a moment, the soft light from the street lamp casting a gentle glow on her features. I don't know what compelled me to get up, to walk over to her, but before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of her yard, calling her name. She turned, surprised to see me, but she smiled nonetheless. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice soft and soothing in the quiet of the night. I shook my head, stepping closer. "No, just needed some air." She nodded, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. There was something about the stillness of the night, the closeness of the moment, that made everything else fade away. I could feel the tension building again, the same tension that had been simmering between us for weeks now. And then, before I could stop myself, I spoke. Lenora, do you ever feel like there's something between us? Something unspoken. She didn't answer right away, but when she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, she said softly. I've felt it too. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. There was no going back now. We had crossed a line, even if it was only with words. I stood there, my pulse quickening, as her words echoed between us. We had finally acknowledged the tension that had been lingering for so long, and with it, something shifted, something inevitable. I took a slow, steady breath, trying to keep my voice calm. What does that mean, Lenora? I asked quietly, my voice betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside me. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes were on me, filled with a mixture of longing and hesitation, as if she, too, was wrestling with something she hadn't fully come to terms with. The street lamp cast a faint glow across her face, highlighting the delicate lines that told stories of years gone by, yet in that moment, she looked almost timeless. I don't know, she finally replied, her voice barely audible. I don't know what it means. But I know I can't ignore it anymore. Her honesty took me by surprise, and suddenly, everything felt raw and exposed between us. This was no longer something that could be brushed off or dismissed. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And yet, the pull between us was undeniable. I took a step closer, my heart racing as the space between us shrank. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made my skin prickle and my mind race with thoughts I hadn't dared to entertain until now. There was something about Lenora that I couldn't shake, the way she looked at me, the way she moved, the quiet confidence she carried. It drew me in, despite the voice in my head warning me to turn back. Lenora, I started, but my voice trailed off, unsure of what to say. I didn't have the words for what I was feeling, didn't know how to articulate the confusing mix of desire and fear that had taken hold of me. But she understood. I could see it in her eyes, in the way her breath hitched as I stepped even closer. She reached out, hesitating for just a moment before her hand found mine. Her touch was soft, tentative, as if she was testing the waters, unsure if I would pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Her fingers tightened around mine, and for a moment, we stood there in the stillness of the night, caught in the weight of what was happening. The world around us seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both dangerous and thrilling. Then, slowly, Lenora let go of my hand, her gaze never leaving mine as she took a step back, the space between us suddenly feeling too large, too empty. This isn't right, she said softly, though there was a tremor in her voice that told me she didn't fully believe her own words. You're so much younger. This, whatever this is, it's not something we can just act on. Her words hit me like a cold splash of water, and for a moment, I felt the weight of the reality we had been avoiding. She was right. There was an undeniable gap between us, not just in age, but in the roles we had played in each other's lives. She was my neighbor, someone I had always admired from afar but never thought of as anything more. And yet, here we were, on the brink of something we both knew was wrong, but couldn't seem to resist. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the swirling emotions inside me. All I knew was that I wanted her, that I had never felt this kind of pull toward anyone before, and it terrified me. Lenora must have sensed my hesitation because she sighed softly, her shoulders sagging as if she had been holding something in for far too long. We need to be careful, she said, her voice filled with regret. We can't let this get out of hand. But even as she said the words, I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was just as caught in this as I was, torn between what she knew was right and what she couldn't deny was happening between us. I know, I whispered, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. But it's hard to ignore. She nodded, her expression softening as she took another step back, distancing herself both physically and emotionally. Maybe it's best if we keep some space, she suggested, though the sadness in her voice was unmistakable. I felt a pang of disappointment at her words, but I knew she was right. We were walking a dangerous line, and any further steps could lead to something we couldn't come back from. And yet, even as I nodded in agreement, a part of me was already wondering if it was too late, if the boundary had already been crossed. The next few days were filled with silence. I didn't see Lenora as often as I used to, and when I did, we exchanged nothing more than polite nods or brief smiles. The tension between us was still there, simmering just below the surface, but we both seemed determined to pretend it didn't exist.
It was easier that way.
Safer.
But the safety didn't last.
One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Lenora standing on my porch, her expression unreadable. My heart leapt into my throat at the sight of her, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "Can I come in?" she asked softly, her eyes searching mine. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The air between us was thick with the unspoken, and I could feel my pulse quicken as she walked past me, her presence filling the small space of my living room. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She stood by the window, looking out at the fading light, her back to me. I could sense the weight of whatever was on her mind, and it made my chest tighten with anticipation. "I can't stop thinking about it," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper.
About what we said.
"About you?" My breath hitched at her words, and suddenly, the tension that had been building between us for weeks came crashing down around us. I stepped toward her, unable to stop myself, the pull between us too strong to resist any longer. "Lenora," I started, but she turned to face me before I could finish, her eyes filled with the same longing I had been trying so hard to deny. And then, before either of us could second-guess it, she crossed the room in a few quick steps and kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid to break the spell. But then it deepened, and all the tension, all the unspoken desire that had been building between us, erupted. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, while her fingers tangled in my hair, her lips moving against mine with an urgency that sent a thrill through me. It was wrong, I knew that. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the way she felt against me, the way her kiss set my skin on fire. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, the reality of what had just happened settled over us like a heavy weight. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. Lenora stepped back, her fingers trembling as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "We shouldn't have done that," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. I reached for her hand, my heart still racing. "Maybe, but I don't regret it." She looked at me, her eyes filled with conflict, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away, that she might leave and never look back. But instead, she let out a soft sigh and leaned into me, her forehead resting against my chest. "I don't know what this means," she admitted quietly. "I don't know where we go from here. Neither did I." But as I held her in my arms, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. We stood there in the dim light of the living room, the world outside slowly fading into darkness. Lenora's head rested gently against my chest, her breathing steady, though I could sense the weight of her thoughts. My own mind was racing, torn between the thrill of what had just happened and the undeniable truth that we had crossed a line neither of us could easily step back from. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, laden with all the emotions we had been trying to suppress for weeks. Finally, Lenora pulled back, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. She looked older in that moment, her eyes reflecting the years she had lived, the experiences she had carried with her. Yet there was also something tender in her gaze, something that made my heart ache. "I'm not sure what to do," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. This is complicated." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I had never been in a situation like this before, never felt such a deep, conflicted pull toward someone who was both a friend and now, something much more. "I know," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to lose this, whatever it is." Her expression softened, but there was still a shadow of uncertainty in her eyes. I don't either, she admitted. But where does it leave us? You're young, and I've lived a lifetime already. This isn't how things are supposed to go. I stepped closer, reaching out to gently cup her face in my hands. Her skin was soft beneath my touch, and I could feel her lean into it, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment as if savoring the closeness. I don't care about how things are supposed to go, I said quietly, my voice firm but gentle. I just know that I care about you. More than I ever expected. She opened her eyes then, searching mine for something, perhaps reassurance, or maybe just the courage to believe that this could work, despite all the reasons it shouldn't. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, but I could see the battle playing out inside her. Finally, she let out a long, slow breath and shook her head, though her hand still held onto mine, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to let go. I've always prided myself on being careful, she said with a sad smile. On making the right choices. But this, being with you, it doesn't feel like a mistake. Her words sent a rush of warmth through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to hers once again. This time, the kiss was slow, tender, filled with all the emotions we had been holding back. It was as if we were both giving in to something inevitable, something we couldn't fight any longer. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other's as we stood there in the quiet of the room. The tension between us had shifted, no longer the sharp edge of something forbidden but the gentle, comforting pull of something real. And yet, beneath the surface, there was still the weight of uncertainty, of knowing that this was far from simple. What now? I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Lenora sighed, her fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw as she thought. I don't know, she admitted, her voice filled with both hope and doubt. We'll have to be careful. This isn't something we can just live out in the open. I nodded, understanding the unspoken implications of her words. There would be judgment, questions, maybe even more than we were prepared to handle. But in that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted her, wanted to explore whatever this was between us, no matter how complicated. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice filled with quiet determination. For a moment, she didn't respond, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. Then, she smiled, a soft, almost wistful smile that made my heart ache. You make it sound so simple, she said, her tone light but edged with something deeper. But I'm not sure it will be. I shook my head, my thumb gently brushing her cheek. It won't be. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. She looked at me then, her eyes softening as she leaned into my touch. You're right, she whispered. It is worth it. We stood there for what felt like hours, holding each other in the stillness of the room, letting the reality of what we had done settle around us. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't going to be easy. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments stolen in the spaces between our regular lives. We didn't speak about what had happened that night to anyone else, and we were careful not to let our connection show when others were around. But whenever we were alone, whether it was in my house or in the garden, away from prying eyes, the tension returned, softer now but no less real. There were moments when I questioned everything, moments when the weight of what we were doing felt too heavy, too complicated. But then Lenora would look at me, or touch my hand, and all the doubt would melt away, replaced by the quiet certainty that this, whatever it was worth the risk. But we couldn't live in that bubble forever. One evening, weeks after that first kiss, Lenora knocked on my door again. This time, her expression was different, somber, thoughtful, as if she had made a decision she wasn't quite ready to share. I let her in, and we sat in the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I've been thinking, she said softly, her eyes downcast. About us. About what this means. I nodded, my heart already sinking, knowing where this conversation was heading but unable to stop it. I care about you, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. More than I ever expected to. But it's not sustainable. We can't keep doing this in secret. And I don't think I'm ready to live this out in the open. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I understood. I knew this had always been a possibility, that the reality of our situation would eventually catch up with us. Still, it didn't make it any easier. What are you saying? I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with sadness and regret. I'm saying that maybe we should stop.
Before it gets too complicated.
Before we end up hurting each other. I wanted to argue, to tell her that we could figure it out, that we didn't have to stop. But the truth was, I had been feeling the same doubt creeping in over the past few days. This wasn't sustainable. And as much as I cared about her, I knew that eventually, the pressure of keeping it all hidden would become too much. So instead of arguing, I nodded, my heart heavy. I understand. For a long time, we just sat there, the silence between us filled with all the things we weren't saying. And then, slowly, Lenora reached out, her hand resting gently on mine. I don't regret any of it, she said softly. Not a single moment. I smiled, though it was bittersweet. Neither do I. We spent that evening together, not as neighbors but as two people who had shared something profound, something that had changed us both. And when she left that night, it wasn't with the promise of more, but with the quiet understanding that sometimes things end not because they weren't right, but because they couldn't last. And though it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do.